Bennett, yesterday at 11:40 a.m., you tweeted a simple 7 words, which I will now quote. I think Jarmusch is growing on me. Would you care to elaborate for the home audience?
Yeah, well, we've been planning this episode for a while, and for a long time, the plan was that I would come in and kind of play the heel. I was the Jarmusch skeptic. We sort of saw this as maybe a sequel to the Scorsese episode where Rob was coming in as kind of a former acolyte turned, what's the opposite of acolyte? I don't know. Turned hater of
Sure.
Scorsese, and yeah, been rewatching a couple of the hits that I was that I was cold on the first time through in preparation for the recording this weekend. And I got to be honest, I think I was a little harsh on them out of the gate. I think I'm letting my not being quite as enthused about Jarmusch as some of my favorite critics annoy me more than it ought to. And in the case of Down by Law in particular, I think I was really misremembering there being more Benigni than there really was. I can remember when I watched it as part of a real Jarmusch binge over like a week and a half, probably right back to back with Night on Earth, which also features a pretty emphatic Benigni performance.
Yes.
It's such a rich meal, you know?
I was pretty shocked you did not like it the first time. Like, that, to me, is about as good as Jarmusch gets.
Yeah, I think I also was just looking to shit on something for having a case of one perfect shot-itis too. I think I was, just kind of like, I was just being a little stinker. And I don't know, rewatching both of these movies that we're about to talk about, I liked them even more. Rob's movie in particular jumped up to number one among Jarmusch features.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I mean, I'm still not, I still don't think he's the guy like a lot of the great critics seem to. I might move him out of the strange seriousness category yet. He might get into expressive esoterica.
There's at least been some development. We'll start there. Welcome once again to Split Picks. I'm Craig Wright. That's Bennett Glace. Over there is Robert Delany. Rob,
hello.
It's been a while. What's going on with you?
It's been a long time. I'm working hard, working all the time. Lots of programming for festivals and theaters and all that sort of stuff. But I'm very excited to speak about Jim Jarmusch because he has been one of my favorite directors for a very long time and someone that whose films are among some of my favorites. So I'm very happy that Bennett has come over to the side of the positive on this one, especially because I would like watch your ratings on Letterboxd and just be absolutely floored. And then I'd get a text from Brett being like, "Oh my God, did you see Bennett's rating of Down by Law?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, oh my God." I say, so there's been a lot of excitement and drama on my end seeing you reacting to Jarmusch. So the cycle has been interesting.
Bennett, what was your first Down by Law star rating? Was it 2.5?
I've stopped giving half-star ratings. I've started going only whole stars. So it was either 2 or 3. I think it was 3, because I think I liked it a little better than Stranger Than Paradise, which I had, with just Thrill of Apostasy, had given 2 stars, which, again, I was a little too hard on. Maybe we'll talk more about this later. I think another hang-up with Jarmusch, I wouldn't say I've crossed fully over to the positive. I would say I'm more in the mixed to positive. That would be yellow on Metacritic. I think a lot of his influences I like a lot better, and a lot of the people he's influenced I like a lot better. I think in Joel Petrakis we see someone who's very clearly riffing on a lot of like situations and characters and conversations out of Jarmusch movies, and I don't know, I like them. I saw them first and liked them better. There's a scene in Ape where Trevor, Joshua Burge's character, literally does the TV dinner monologue. I like that sort of Midwestern ball busting, I guess, better than anything in Jarmusch. So coming to Jarmusch, hearing Rosenbaum and Jay Hoberman talk about him as like on the level of Cassavetes, I couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Okay. But again, he can only go up, and it's growing on me with every watch. At least the older films.
This is why I'm glad to have both of you here today, because you are both coming from different perspectives on him. I mean, Rob, you mentioned you pretty much fell in love with his stuff from the start, and Bennett, you're warming up to him. But I'm just curious if you could both give me your little mini scouting report on him. What's your basic read on him as a director, and why do you both feel the way you do about his films?
I first saw Jarmusch during undergrad, and I actually did a project where I would watch all of his most famous work, or I guess essential work, and then form my own thoughts about them. And then after I form my own thoughts about each film, look at all of the sort of critical consensus from journalists or critics or whoever. And it was sort of a eye-opening experience, because a lot of the films that I really gravitated towards from him were reviled in the media, especially The Limits of Control. Like, his more boundary pushing work, his more experimental work was less popular. So it was one of my like first introductions to sort of how these sort of films operate in the space. But Jim Jarmusch, as director, is like one of the sort of darlings of American independent film. And he has been since the 1980s. Like, Stranger Than Paradise is sort of cited by many as being one of the first films to really kick off the American independent film craze. And so that's probably his most famous work. But to me, when I think of Jim Jarmusch, I think of someone who is very engrossed in the world around him. Like, a lot of his films are very landscaped based. And when I think about his films, I almost think about the cities that they're filmed in or the regions that they're filmed in, as much as the story or the characters or anything like that. And he's also not very concerned with the narrative a lot of the times. Like, his films aren't exactly non-narrative, but I think what he says a lot of the times is that he wants his films to often feel like a dream, or to feel like a wild ride or a wild trip, instead of acts or something like that. Instead of feeling like, oh, now we're going from act 1 to act 2. It's supposed to be sort of this continuum of experience. And we'll get into all of his sort of his idiosyncrasies and techniques later, but that's what I think about first when I think about Jim Jarmusch.
So much like the last director we discussed, Jim Jarmusch is a guy whose reputation precedes him. Like you mentioned, he's one of the leading figures of American independent cinema, kind of the first generation of post-New Hollywood filmmakers. So, we talked about Scorsese and how Scorsese's narrative, being like an asthmatic kid in New York, almost joining the priesthood, informs a lot of his films and always seems to be mentioned in like interviews and profiles of him. Jarmusch is similar in the sense that you always seem to read that he is, a Midwestern transplant to New York who was very, very embroiled in the kind of no-wave art scene. This New York that we're constantly reminded doesn't exist anymore. And I think part of my knee-jerk aversion to him is my just like disdain for like, man, we were there, man, type profiles, which every bit of writing on Jarmusch seems to involve a little bit of that. Which I sent you guys that series of reverse shot essays. I think the pieces on Stranger Than Paradise and Permanent Vacation in particular speak to a kind of weariness with like hearing about this story. They're really sort of like, I think they were written in like 2006 around the release of Broken Flowers, and there's a sense that like Jarmusch has maybe like overstayed his welcome. But yeah, no, he had always been for me one of those people that was held up as one of the guys, a person whose films are like immediately recognizable, a true auteur in that sense. But I don't think I'd ever seen one of his films until I saw Patterson around its release in 2016, and I hated it. And people really, really liked that movie. It's like a perfectly agreeable movie, and I like everyone in it. But yeah, I couldn't stand it. I thought it was very pleased with itself. I thought like lots of critics I couldn't stand gave this like rapturous praise to it that I just felt totally alienated from. So I was, I was not in a hurry to watch most of the rest of his films, and I feel like that I maybe hadn't seen any others until I started watching them in preparation for this. I knew Limits of Control in particular as alienating among even fans of his. Weirdly, I think I'd first heard about it in my IMDb message board days. I remember someone having it as like their best picture winner for 2009 and thinking that was a pretty esoteric choice. Yeah, I don't know. My perception of Jarmusch is that he's much like Scorsese too, also really like an ambassador for the stuff he likes. He gives a lot of interviews where he talks about his influences, and there's I think there's I listen to like a Lincoln Center talk where he goes through like 10 of his films. But I guess to relate it to Scorsese one more time, I think part of why I gravitate toward his films more is I find I relate more to the Scorsese like personality. He like talks too fast. He's very much like a dork. And Jarmusch, the number one word you always hear associated with him is cool.
Right.
He is this like laconic, sort of bemused affect. They both have really like distinct looks. I don't know. I'm so skeptical of anyone who is cool, which again, like I shouldn't hold against him. I shouldn't be like such a like I shouldn't be so the stereotype of like a critic, like a critic who just like hates artists because he can't be them. But I when I read a profile of Jarmusch and I'm reminded how like cool he is, I'm always like, oh.
Darn him. All right, well, before we fully launch into Jarmusch, I do just want to take a quick second because this episode is going to be coming out on what is Split Tooth's 4th birthday. We are an April Fool's baby, and this is year 4 we're entering. So I just want to take a quick second to, thank you guys, especially all the Split Tooth writers. I mean, I really feel like we're having a good year so far, and I mean, Bennett, you have a piece that just came out on a movie you loved and one you did not love. It's been a fun one to read. We have a few new writers who've been killing it, so just wanted to give a shout out to all our people. And I never say it because I hate saying it, but we're a small site, so please like, subscribe, all that stuff. It really does make a difference. And we're just happy doing this, so thank you for listening. And with that, let's jump into today's movies. Rob, you pitched this episode with your movie in mind. Do you want to tell us what it is and why it stands out to you in particular?
Sure. So I picked The Limits of Control, which came out in 2009, and it is a assassin spy action film with no action. I think that's one of the best ways to sort of get into this film. And to me, it's sort of the culmination of all of his early work. I think that's one of the interesting differences between how Bennett and I sort of have been in dialogue with Jarmusch's work is I think the first Jarmusch film I saw was Permanent Vacation. Like, I think I started with his first film and then went on from there. So his early work in particular is really sort of close to my heart. And I remember, I think I watched like Permanent Vacation, Stranger Than Paradise, Down by Law, Dead Man, and then ended with The Limits of Control. So it was almost this climax to me sort of, experiencing his work. And when you see Limits in that light, I think it's pretty clear that it's Jarmusch taking the gloves off. Like, it's so concentrated with ideas. It feels extremely unconventional that the reasons why he made it, things like that, comes out so clear when he wanted to make a film to show people you don't have to make films in a certain way. I think that's some of the best sort of ways to get into this film in particular. And I think that's one of the reasons why it is so divisive. Like, famously, Roger Ebert gave it, I think, a half of a star on his review and gave it like a few sentences. And he was very famously a Jarmusch fanboy. He loved Jarmusch's films. But when he was met with Jarmusch at his most Jarmusch or Jarmusch at his most experimental, he hated it and spat it out. Which is, I think, also why I sort of gravitated towards this film in the beginning, because I knew that there was something going on here that the establishment was not okay with in a lot of different ways. So that's why I picked Limits, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this film and trying to unpack it so that some of the I guess toxicity about this film can maybe dissipate a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this film was really derided upon release. I think it came immediately after Broken Flowers, which I think was a breakthrough of sorts. I think Bill Murray was nominated for a Golden Globe.
Biggest box office too. Yeah.
I want to say I misspoke before. Broken Flowers is the first Jarmusch movie I saw, and I saw it probably back in like 2010. So obviously, if you turned the episode off because you heard me talking about how I'm like shitting on a director who I have only really experienced over the last like 3 months, I want to assure you I have had time to reflect on Jarmusch through Broken Flowers, and I think my sort of indifference toward Broken Flowers is another reason I wasn't all that keen on watching more of his films right out of the gate.
Right.
But yeah, you mentioned it's an action film with no action, and it's him at his most experimental. Just about all of the films he had made up to this point were kind of genre movies with the genre elements you would most expect kind of snipped out. Mm-hmm. Down by Law is the prison break movie where we don't see them actually break out or even really find out the details of how they're going to do it. It's Stranger Than Paradise is a road movie where neither the journey nor the destination are all that compelling. Well, what else? Dead Man and Ghost Dog are both genre riffs that are pretty pared down and bizarre.
Mm.
Yeah, and especially I think of Mystery Train as well, where instead of a film that's sort of steeped in the mystique of like music history in Memphis and things like that, and going, in the mythology of Elvis and people of his ilk, is like completely drained out of the presentation as well. So it's this film that is in dialogue with certain aspects of like cultural mythology and sort of completely sort of cuts it down with the most brutal honesty possible.
Right. Yeah. Another road trip movie with no conventional
Yeah.
payoff. Yeah.
And so Bennett, Rob picked his immediately. You took a few months to decide which one, and I'm really glad you picked this one because it is another one that's like totally a Jarmusch film, but it's on the exact opposite extreme of Limits of Control. So why did you pick your movie? What stood out to you about it?
I think they're more similar than everybody might want to admit. No, I picked The Dead Don't Die, his most recent and certainly his least beloved film. Because I think I wanted to pick another controversial one. I think this and Limits are definitely his two most controversial films. Even people who love Jarmusch are perhaps unlikely to have any affection for these ones. And I think it's like Limits, a pretty confrontational film. A film that just kind of really lets the audience have it. And if you're not on its wavelength, it can be a really tough sit. I like that both movies are pretty long, too. So it really forces you to sit with it if you're not on the wavelength. The Dead Don't Die is, much like Limits of Control is an assassin movie where most of the cool assassin stuff is cut out. This is a zombie movie where the escalating tension takes 45 minutes and nobody notices the warning signs except Tom Waits, who is just talking to himself. And I don't know, has a pretty goofy, lackadaisical tone throughout, which is sort of I don't know, I see it as the lighter version of Limits of Control almost.
There, yeah.
They're both kind of circular movies too. Jarmusch movies up to this point are, there's a lot of road trips, and then there's kind of mission movies like Ghost Dog. And then more recently, he's found himself in kind of a ponderous sort of circular place. Only Lovers Left Alive, another movie of his, which I really can't stand, has a lot of sort of circular motifs. There's a lot of tires and records and stuff. And then Patterson is about a guy whose day is exactly the same every day. It's almost like John Dielman-like in the fact that we keep seeing the same events. And there's, again, circular motifs. And here he seems to be taking that to an extreme. Everyone seems to be just kind of going around in circles. And I don't know, the same way Limits of Control seems to have that repetition and that circularity, and for all we know at the end he could be going to do all the same things over again. The Dead Don't Die kind of has that. Mm-hmm. Even before it started, there already is a sense that every day has been the same.
Yeah. And I do think Jarmusch's career, when you zoom out, is a lot more interesting than if you just focus on each film, because Limits of Control came after Broken Flowers. Now, I've read that I think this was the one where there was a film he tried to make that fell through in between, but Broken Flowers brought in nearly $50 million in the box office worldwide. Limits of Control brought in $2 million. Rob, do you want to just give us a general overview of what Limits of Control is about, and just a little bit about how it's structured?
Sure. So the Limits of Control is sort of centered on this, I think he's almost called the lone man, or the lone figure. It's played by Isaac de Bancalay, who is in other Jarmusch films as well, like Ghost Dog. And the narrative is extremely confusing, but sort of the structure of it is that he sort of travels from place to place, going from the metropolis of Madrid to sort of the country or the desert. And at each stop, he speaks with another sort of agent who has these cryptic conversations with him, and then gives him a piece of paper with writing on it or code, or gives him diamonds or something like that. And eventually he's sort of tasked with assassinating somebody for reasons that are never explained. So it sort of sits in that trope of an assassin film where he has to travel long distances to get his target, quote unquote. But the journey is extremely different than, any assassin film that has ever been made, and on purpose. I mean, Jarmusch has, said explicitly that he wanted to make an action film with no action and a suspense film with no drama, things like that. So that's the overall structure. And on its face, that doesn't sound that interesting, but it's everything that sort of happens in between these conversations, during these conversations, that to me makes the film very interesting. And sort of speaking to your point, Craig, about it not making very much money, I think one of the things that alienates people so much about this film is because it's so technique driven. It's a very technical film. And so there are not these large narrative events like a shooting or someone beats up somebody else or there's a car chase or something like that. The big events are like, wow, he just filmed the same staircase like 7 different ways and it looked completely different each time. So it really, I don't know, it appeals to like the film nerd, I guess, in all of us in that way, where he's trying to like stretch technique and craft so much, which we'll talk about, I assume, later as well.
And from what I've read, it sounds like they approached this without a typical script. I mean, Jarmusch called it a minimal map, where they basically had 25 pages and of the whole movie, and then they would write dialogue the night before. I mean, do you think that's a benefit to this film where it wasn't so like set in stone?
Yeah, I think that's a huge benefit to the film because I think one of the things I really like about it is the flow of it. And he said in interviews as well that he wanted this to feel like a dream, to have a sort of dream logic about it. And I think that really benefits the conversations in particular because every time he speaks with someone, he speaks with Tilda Swinton or he speaks to another, actor in the film. There are almost these like small nested ideas that don't seem to have an overall point into the narrative. Like, what does this have to do with an assassin killing some target? It doesn't. But it's like a dream where things sort of crop up and disappear without a trace, and some of the conversations relate to each other in a little bit. But to me, that makes the film really interesting, right? It adds a lot of variety to the film, and it adds a lot of complexity and texture to film. Like, to me, this film is like all texture. And I think that loosey-goosey nature of the production process allows for things to happen like that. And he even spoke about how there's sort of like a contradiction in the filmmaking process where it's such a rigid system where, how many days you have to shoot has to do with how much money you have and scheduling and all of these things. But the creative process is not really like that for Jim Jarmusch. Like, it's more flowing. So I think that's why, to me, this film is a really good intersection of that contradiction to the very controlled process of production filmmaking and the sort of dreamlike process of, creativity.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me to learn that this was like a response to a project falling through or something.
From what I could find, it sounds like it was a third music-based movie that was supposed to be in Kansas City. I just can't remember if this was when it was supposed to happen.
I don't know. It feels like very much like I could see it either being a response to a movie falling through or a sort of knee-jerk response to the success of Broken Flowers. Like, are you sure you're really with me here, folks?
Right.
Sort of a thing. Like, it feels like an early example of like late style. Like a test of like who the real fans are. It's interesting that he would, kind of evolve once more in between this film and The Dead Don't Die, which now really feels like old guy Jim Jarmusch.
Well, Bennett, one thing we talked about in the Clint Eastwood episode is how so often it seems like Clint does one for me, one for the fans. This is definitely like a one for me movie.
This is about as one for me as a movie gets, yeah.
Yeah. And that's why I like it. It feels like self-indulgence in a interesting way. Like, I think a lot of the times when I see a film and it's very indulgent on the director, I sort of cringe, and that's like sort of a pet peeve. But in this regard, I feel like he indulges in the right places, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like he's like subtler in his like pastiches here than he often is. Like, I don't know, when someone makes like an homage as deliberate as like Forrest Whitaker shooting through the sink in Ghost Dog, as cool as it looks, I can't help but like roll my eyes at like someone just up and like stealing something. Whereas like this, he talks about it being a riff on Point Blank, and it really does seem to get the weird, eerie rhythm of Point Blank. Like, it seems to borrow things that I like about Point Blank without, without being so obviously like a pastiche artist, without being like Tarantino-y about it. Not to totally shit on Tarantino. I mean, I like it sometimes when he does it too. But like, I know we were sort of talking beforehand. I think it's Amazon is readapting the Walker novels from which Point Break is adapted with Robert Downey Jr. taking on the Lee Marvin role, all 5'1" of Robert Downey Jr. And I think Isaac Debakele is a much better choice for sort of a Lee Marvin riff. I think part of why he's so good in this is that he feels like elemental. I don't know, he's like I don't know, he's like, he often plays kind of like man of few words sort of roles, and I feel like this is like the apotheosis of that. I don't know, he's so like subtly intimidating, and I don't know, much like Lee Marvin, he's violent looking. Like Lee Marvin has that crazy mouth, and Debakele has these big cheekbones. They're both really tall and skinny.
Yeah.
I kind of wish we got to see him kill more people in this stuff. I mean, I know why Jarmusch only has him kill one guy, but it makes you long for an assassin movie starring Isaac Debakele. Like, it makes you long for them casting him in the Walker readaptation.
Well, he has such an incredible presence to him. I mean, I think that's one of my favorite parts of the film is that he's such a tonal anchor to every single scene, which is why I love being in sort of his sensorium. Like Jarmusch does these things where he has these montages of what Bankole is sort of paying attention to in the background. So it'll be like a shot of birds, someone walking around, a car driving. But my favorite aspect is when Bankole actually goes to the museums and like looks at art, and his intensity is so infectious in those moments, especially as someone who like, I love going to museums and like sitting down on a bench and staring at a painting for 15 minutes. And, you know, like I'm that guy who, just for context, if you haven't seen the film, Bankole will walk into these gallery rooms and he'll look at a painting. And there will be this zoom in the camera into Bankole, and then we'll cut to the painting and back and forth, back and forth.
It's one painting a day he looks at, right?
Yeah. And the music swells and the background goes out of focus. And it feels like you can like feel his attention. You can feel him like communing and connecting with the art in front of him. And I relate to that so deeply, sort of on a personal level. And I think it takes an actor like Bankole to sort of communicate that to an audience, because he has such a presence to him and such an atmosphere to him, where he can communicate something as ethereal as what it feels like to connect with a painting. You know what I mean? I think it's really difficult to do that in film because it's such an internal feeling. Like, how are you supposed to externalize that without dialogue or something more overt or more explicit? And he does it in this really interesting way. And I think Bankole, like, I can't see anybody else playing this role to me. I think he's absolutely perfect.
And he's so different in every Jarmusch movie. Like, he's never the same character, from the cab driver in Night on Earth, the French ice cream man and Ghost Dog. Like, I didn't even recognize him as the same person. It's like, wait, no way. Like, he can.
His role in Ghost Dog is really out of left field for the type of characters he usually plays.
Yeah, he's a bit of
such
chameleon.
a goofy character. So there's a lot of like looking in this movie. There's the performance where the flamenco performers sort of repeat some of the dialogue we've heard. There's him like kind of looking out of like train windows and stuff, and he pointedly does a lot of like looking at Paz de la Huerta's character. There's a sort of a spectatorship there. I don't know. I mean, to what extent do you think it's a movie about movies? I mean, I know that could be sort of like trite. But,
no, yeah.
I don't know. I was taken on the last viewing by like him noticing Tilda Swinton in the movie poster dressed like when he sees her.
Yeah, I mean, there's an explicit moment talking about, I guess, movie viewership too, where in what conversation it is. It's the third conversation with Tilda Swinton, where she is speaking. She walks up to Bankole, of course, like walking in slow motion as pigeons fly everywhere, and it's this very dramatic
white
sequence.
Suit, white hair.
Yeah. And she sits down and she starts talking about how she enjoys watching films. And she says things like the best films are like dreams you've never sure you've had. And she loves it, you know, just looking at the mise en scène, like looking at clothing, looking at how, you know, rooms are arranged, cars and trains and things like that. And she describes a way to view films that you're not sort of taught to, you know what I mean? Like, I think especially when I started out like in school studying film, you're supposed to identify like events and scenes and acts and all these like concrete things that make up a film, almost like a, you know, mathematical formula, like this happens, so this happens, so this happens. And she's describing it in this really interesting, like atmospheric, abstract way. And I think for me, I'm not, you know, trying to put words in Jim Jarmusch's mouth, but to me, he's like, oh, this is how you should experience this film as well. You should experience this film as almost like, you know, purely experiential in a way that feels, like a dream. Like I'll say it a million times or something like that.
Are you familiar with how he came up with Tilda Swinton's role?
No.
So he had an interview where he said that Tilda's 8-year-old son had asked her, what were dreams like before cinema? And I guess she wrote this really beautiful essay about what dreams and like the overlap between dreams and cinema and how they like mesh. And so he pulled lines directly from that and like inserted them between stuff he'd written, and so it was kind of a combination of the two. And the interviewer was like, oh, did she notice? He was like, oh yeah, she noticed.
I love that. That's amazing.
Do you see the other conversations as at all related to how you're supposed to appreciate art or watch the movie? Because I found myself, I don't know, on the last viewing, like looking for differences in the routine between every conversation and trying to see if they somehow reflected an approach to art that, the conversation showed. I don't know. I guess we were talking about influences. John Hurt's conversation is what, like, all about the etymology of the word bohemia or something. And I guess I found myself thinking, like, is that maybe representing a style of film viewership that's just like spot the reference, or like, where did this come from? And I don't know. I mean, maybe you seem to be suggesting that maybe he has more respect for Tilda's character or something, or that we're meant to take that conversation more seriously. And I think she is the only person he talks to that he then encounters later on at all, right? When he sees her on the poster.
Yeah. And I mean, but I think the other conversation I guess would sort of relate to that one is the Gael Garcia Bernal conversation towards the end, where he's talking about sort of like hallucinations and subjectivity, like his quote, everything changes by the color of glass you see through, things like that. Nothing's true, everything's imagined. And he's talking about like peyote trips and things like that. I think, that is also pointing to another way to enjoy art. Like I think when you go to a museum with people sometimes and all they do is read the plaques underneath and they just want to know, like, when did this painting come out? Who is the artist? What was their life like? But they're not actually like looking at the painting and having their own like subjective experience with the art. I think that's one of the things that sort of that scene is poking to, as well, that like, and he said this explicitly, that not everybody has to take the limits of control in the same way. And he said that in another Lincoln Center interview, that he wants people to have their own experiences with the film and to sort of take their own things from it and, use it as a kaleidoscope of sorts.
I think, after the conversation with Gael Garcia Bernal, the film does seem to get into, not quite more hallucinatory, but it does get a little even dreamier than it's been. Yeah. There's, of course, when he assassinates Bill Murray at the end, he just sort of appears inside. He says, I use my imagination, which I like because it can it can mean, like, I was imaginative. It could be like a very carefully sort of a dickish answer. It can mean, oh, I was imaginative in how I, like, dispatched those guys, or it can mean, just I appear here. And also, I like, we talked about the sort of like, there's a sort of a digital Lynchian vibe to that car trip out to the compound with the sort of first person out of the dashboard. I don't know. It wouldn't shock me if Lynch said it influenced Twin Peaks: The Return. I don't know. There's a lot of like first person out of like cars going down like desert roads. Feels a little similar. I don't know. That's, I guess, the one example where I can think of the conversation really seeming to affect the material moving forward.
So, Bennett, I know you are a huge fan of peak TV. I found a quote where Jarmusch calls TV the worst threat to innovation in cinema. And to me, this movie is kind of the opposite of, the loud, flashy, sexy stuff we see everywhere that people say is, genius. I'm just curious how you feel this film functions like, because it was in 2006, so before, what was that, like the kickoff of peak TV?
Mad Men premiered in like 2008. You're getting there. The Sopranos is very much like,
it's coming up.
Well, yeah. I think the content industrial complex that's been enabled by TV, it runs on crowd work, basically. It runs on references that you'll get. It runs on like, oh, hey, all my friends are here. Here's CGI Luke Skywalker. It runs on the familiar, and this is a movie where, besides it featuring faces that you'll recognize from Jim Jarmusch and maybe making sort of a bleak reference to films that like fans of his will know he's a fan of, it really doesn't offer any of that sort of like fan service that I associate with content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the best example in the film which is also my favorite moment in the film too, is the flamenco sequence where I can't imagine the flamenco sequence sort of operating in that world, in the television world. I could see a producer being like, what's the point of this? Cut it for time or something like that. Like there would be nothing, I guess, like of merit to something like the flamenco sequence to, in a film executive or something like that, because it would just confuse a viewer. And for people who haven't seen the film too, Bankole walks into, I guess, this bar or like performance space, black box space. And all of the chairs and all the tables are flipped over, and it's clearly not in business. It's clearly closed. And he just sort of waltzes in, and there are some flamenco performers practicing or rehearsing on stage, and he just sits down and sort of watches them rehearse in this like weird pitter-pattery performance where they go and they stop and they go and they stop. And at a certain point, the dancer just keeps going and the guitarist is playing and the singer is singing. And it's this just wonderful moment where you're able to sit and just enjoy this. You're enjoying, artistry. You know what I mean? You're having this like quiet moment with Bankole and with these artists in a scene, in a scenario that doesn't have a huge audience there or something like that. It's like an incredibly quiet, contemplative moment. And to me, that when I watch peak TV or when I watch prestige television, there's none of that. There's no moments really of like contemplation and silence and meditation in that way, especially ones that feel as indulgent as, the flamenco sequence feels.
Or if they exist, they draw such attention to themselves that they're like set pieces in video games. They're designed for a vulture list. It's like, we need to talk about that scene from last week's episode of Scenes from a Marriage or whatever.
So I think I just have one more question for this section, and it's in the same line, just because nothing in this movie is obvious. And I do love that in interviews, he just dodges questions. Like we talked about before we started recording, where someone asks him like a very specific question about this movie, and he just goes, I'd rather talk about Pythagoras. But he really presents this as a blank slate, where you almost like a Brakhage film, like it's just what you make of it. And I'm just curious if you think forcing people to think about a movie is why this only brought in $2 million as opposed to Broken Flowers, which I will say is his most simplistic movie. I think it's, I just love that those come back to back.
Yeah, I mean, this film requires a lot of attention. Like, this is not a film that will hold your hand and carry you through it, which sometimes makes it, this will sound bad, like a difficult watch. Like, it's not a film that you're going to sit back and relax to, even though it's one of my favorite films of all time. And it even took me a while to get through it on revisiting it, because I was taking so many notes and finding so many things. It's a film where you can just like sit and think about it for hours and hours about, why this film works, even though it's so strange. And so I do think that's one of the reasons why people have trouble with it. I mean, a similar situation that I've talked about on Split Tooth Podcast before is Roger Ebert's, take on Taste of Cherry as well, the Kiarostami film. Like, any film that where you really have to sort of meditate on it to try and understand it, or put a lot of thought into why this film works, or how was this film made, or where the filmmaker is coming from, don't seem to do so well in the zeitgeist. And those films often get smashed down, particularly like people like Roger Ebert, who gave this, a half a star. And I think he gave something similar to Taste of Cherry, where you almost see critics not engage with it like a Kelly Reichardt film or something like that. Something, you can have a big board with all of the connecting strings to all these different films and all these different directors, like, Charlie Day and Always Sunny or something like that. And there's a reason why a lot of these films are sort of underseen and reviled by some, and then evangelized by others. And I think that it takes, it's a different form of viewing.
Yeah, I don't know. Broken Flowers is a very like Sundancey film.
Yeah,
whereas like this is so like consciously like arty. I don't know. I it's maybe simplistic to suggest that it was just sort of a reaction against that sort of new level of popularity. But Yeah, I don't know. It's like the film equivalent of like sitting in a museum and looking at a painting. You sort of have to really kind of be paying attention, and you have to sort of really be serious about it. Um, that said, it's a more fun film than I think that makes it sound. I don't know. I think if you do sort of tune into it, it offers a lot of pleasures. It's shot by Christopher Doyle. I mean, it's nice to look at. It's the Boris soundtrack is great.
Yeah. I mean, if you're the kind of person that likes to sort of spend 3 hours in a museum wandering around, listlessly and just going from beautiful art to beautiful art, this is the perfect film for you. So if you enjoy that experience, then you'll love this film. And I think that, type of personality is not always, I guess, I don't know what the word would be for it, but promoted in cinema, especially mainstream American cinema. That's not necessarily the type of viewing that it gets, promoted. So
It's the opposite of entertainment.
yeah,
It's very deliberate and purposeful.
yeah, and it's weird. It's like I think that's the complexity of Jarmusch too. Is like he says he wants to make a film that's like a dream where you can wander, but it seems weirdly focused. I think that's what makes him such an interesting person for me too. Is that he's obsessed with contradiction in his films, but he also seems to like have a lot of contradiction in his interviews and between like his ideas for his films and how they're produced and things like that. I think that makes like these films much more interesting too, is that you can, dwell on the contradictions and they sort of, mirror the complexity of the person who's making them instead of, being this shiny little diamond that's, sold like product. So
Yeah, I don't know. It's again, maybe I'm being like, maybe it's too simplistic a way of looking at it, but I think it's also a pretty like trollish film. I think it's like kind of like
Yeah.
deliberately like goading you into going down rabbit holes and stuff. There's a lot of there's a lot of MacGuffins, like deliberately meaningless little plot elements, which again is a quality I think it has in common with The Dead Don't Die. I think they're both kind of like trolls on the audiences who showed up expecting one thing and got something very different.
yeah.
Well, with that being said, let's take a quick break. We're going to talk about zombies. We'll be back. The Dead Don't Die is Jarmusch's most recent film. Came out in 2019. I personally did not see it until a few months ago because I had heard exclusively negative things about it, with the most positive reviews being that it was merely a disappointment. Maybe it's because I entered expecting a complete train wreck of a film, but I was honestly surprised by how much I enjoyed it. It's a low-stakes comedy that was clearly just made for the fun of it. I think if a filmmaker who didn't have Jarmusch's reputation made it, the reception would definitely have skewed more positive. What were your first reactions to The Dead Don't Die, and when did you see it?
So it came with some expectations. There's obviously quite a star-studded cast. Jarmusch's reputation obviously precedes him, and despite my misgivings, his recent output has been just about as acclaimed as anything he's ever made. At least in terms of the contemporary response. So I also avoided it when it came out because the reviews turned out to be overwhelmingly negative, despite all the hype. I think it premiered at Cannes, even in competition. I could be wrong, which is crazy. I would have loved to have seen this in theaters. I actually really regret that I didn't now, because watching it, going through Jarmusch's films recently and trying to decide what to discuss for the podcast, and hoping to pick something off the beaten path, knowing I was a bit of a skeptic towards some of the acclaimed Jarmusch's, I found a film that has only grown in my estimation with each viewing. It is just a defiantly stupid, half-assed movie, and I think if it wasn't made by and starring people with reputations to uphold, I think it would be at least a so bad it's good classic amongst a wider group of people.
Well, I did see it in theaters.
Oh, what was that like?
Unfortunately, it was crickets. I mean, I saw it in New York, and I don't even think there were many people in the theater. I went with a couple of friends, who fell asleep during it, and I stayed awake to watch the whole thing. And they woke up like towards the end, and they asked me like, "Hey, do we miss anything?" And I was like, "No,
No,
like
not really.
honestly, you didn't really miss anything. You could just go back to sleep." And I think that is really sort of my biggest thing with the film, is that I feel so connected to, I guess, his more quote unquote profound work, that when I see The Dead Don't Die, I'm like, I just want another amazing Jarmusch film. And it's just like, it has all of his sort of idiosyncrasies that I can't stand, that is usually diluted by interesting technique. And I think seeing it on a second go around, I will say I definitely didn't hate it as much as I did back then. I think I was more of, idealistic when I first saw it in theaters. So I see your point that like it really is just like a fun movie that's supposed to be light and silly. But I can't help thinking about how connected I am with his work that seems to take itself a little more seriously. And I would have loved to see a film like that with this subject. I think that would have been interesting. So.
Yeah. Limits of Control, he's hanging out in the museum. Here, he's rolling around in the mud.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
I think also some of my maybe a little outsized affection for it is because, like, I can't help but compare it to other kind of similarly themed, like, oh, we're fucked sort of movies that have come out from, like, major directors, most notably Adam McKay. The great Adam McKay's Don't Look Up, which has a very similar tone to Tom Waits' voiceovers in this movie, which are sort of stoner philosophizing on like how badly we fucked up the planet, like really dealing in banalities. And I think Jarmusch sort of is tongue-in-cheek, kind of knows that like the movie is really dumb and that like, it has nothing profound to say about our current kind of mid-apocalypse state, whereas like Adam McKay, I think, genuinely thinks if he were the president, like we'd solve climate change.
Yeah.
So before we solve climate change, Bennett, you wanted to give us a quick background of what The Dead Don't Die is all about beyond the zombie word?
So The Dead Don't Die is set in a town called Centerville. I think it's in either Pennsylvania or Ohio, sort of Jim Jarmusch's kind of Midwestern milieu. And it's mostly focused on a cast of characters and almost Altman-like tapestry of small-town oddballs. Most notably, three cops played by Bill Murray, Adam Driver, and Chloe Sevigny. There is a hermit who lives out in the woods, played by Tom Waits. I'll say one thing for Jarmusch, and I think he basically introduced the world to Tom Waits, the actor, in Down by Law. Love it. Great move. I cannot stand Tom Waits' music, most of it. Love Tom Waits, the actor. Big fan.
Rather great, yeah.
You've also got a diner, the proprietor of which is Esther Ballant from Stranger Than Paradise. Now kind of talking with like sort of a exaggerated like American accent, which I thought was pretty funny. You have Steve Buscemi as the local racist farmer. You've got Danny Glover as kind of his long-suffering, not quite friend. You've got Rosie Perez as a newswoman named Posey Juarez to give you a sense of the humor we're dealing with here. And there's also there's a group of like out-of-towners featuring Selena Gomez. There's some juvenile delinquents who escape from a juvenile detention facility. And basically, we check in on all of these characters throughout the film as a zombie outbreak occurs because of some sort of like vague apocalyptic environmental disaster. I think there's been like polar fracking or something has like put the planet off its axis. Again, like that's the sort of sense of humor and the level of kind of how we live now insight we're dealing with here. It's kind of a movie that's pretty consciously just kind of putting its hand into the sort of grab bag of buzzwords and key phrases and kind of putting that onto the zombie genre.
Let's hop on this now. Why do you feel the film was so dismissed when it came out?
Like I said, it's almost like confrontationally half-baked. There are these kind of really like low-hanging fruit, fourth wall breaks throughout.
Yeah.
Like toward the end of the film, Bill Murray is like, "God damn it, Jim! For all I've done for that asshole," and it's like, that's like tantamount to Daffy Duck complaining about their deal in Space Jam. Like it's that level of like Hollywood insider stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think Jarmusch has this huge reputation. He's really known as the guy. I think people welcomed Only Lovers Left Alive and Patterson as maybe indicating kind of a new era for him of kind of slower star vehicles, finding him in kind of like a meditative pace. I think this took a lot of that to extreme that people really weren't expecting. And I think people really resent paying like $15 to see a movie that just sort of acknowledges how stupid it is throughout, where aliens show up just because, where every character dies, most of them off screen. I think people really felt like cheated. Similar to, I mean, the same way if someone went into Limits of Control expecting they were going to see, Isaac de Bakale as a globetrotting assassin, they might feel like they'd, been duped a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, when my moment was when you see the zombie moan Wi-Fi and they're holding their cell phone.
Bit, yeah.
That's the moment where my eyes rolled and was like, I can't take this anymore. On my first viewing, now I could take it a little lighter, but this film just seems there's so much. I mean, the fourth wall breaks in particular are what sort of bothered me.
They were bad.
Yeah, they bothered me on this viewing. I don't know if they really bothered me on my first viewing. I didn't even remember them.
Well, they were so half-assed. Like, oh, it's the soundtrack.
Yeah, and
come on.
And I think
music to my ears.
I think there are some like fourth wall breaking moments in Limits too, like when Tilda Swinton says, "I love it when people in films sit and don't say anything to each other, and then they sit and don't say anything to each other for like 10 seconds." But to me, that's like more interesting and funny than them explicitly going, "Oh, I read the script." Yeah. Oh, Jim only gave me our scenes, and Adam Driver saying, "Oh, this is the theme song of the film," and you're going like, any director can do this. Like, this doesn't take any tact, or this is not interesting to me.
I think there's some more subtle stuff in some of the fourth wall breaks, I'll say. And this is maybe me getting a little too high-minded. Maybe me suggesting the movie has more on its mind than it really does. I don't know. I think you can take something like Adam Driver saying, like, "Well, this isn't good. This is going to end badly, but we got to give it our best shot." Isn't that true of life itself? We know it's going to end badly, but we've got to give it a shot. I think maybe that's some of what Jim Jarmusch is saying, because I think he said in interviews that he very pointedly does not show us the fate of the escaped juvenile delinquents. They, one of them says, like, "I know somewhere we can hide," and then we don't see them again. So it is. Even if it is a movie that ends with all of the main characters dying, Adam Driver holding like Selena Gomez's like severed head, and Tom Waits in a voiceover saying like, "Boy, we really gribbled it up this time." There is sort of a little bit of hope there, and I think he is maybe on Driver's side. I think Driver is maybe what we get sort of the closest we maybe get to a Jarmusch surrogate in the film through some of those lines like that.
He does sneak in a lot of political overtones that I think probably also threw some people off. I mean, do you think those are a strength or a weakness of this?
It's hard to say if it's a strength or a weakness, because I think the whole point of like, at least my definition of late style, which I should say, like, as defined by Edward Said, was never like fully defined. Like, I think his collection of essays on it was compiled after his death, so I use that as an excuse to have my own sort of fuzzy definition of it. But I think part of what's so great about late style is that like the pros and cons of the movie really start to blend.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's very clear that Jarmusch is pretty boomer-brained politically in the post-Trump world. There's just a lot of interviews where he's saying a lot of the same stuff that like artists his age are saying about like, I really admire this Greta Thunberg and these kids in Florida. Like, a lot of that, which like is like well-meaning, and like we all admire this stuff, but like it's not all that profound coming from like a master filmmaker to be like riffing on these ideas. So I don't know. I think that Dead Don't Die has maybe revealed him to be a little boomer-brained, and I think like as befuddled by like the state of things as anybody else, which I think is maybe like a scary thing for someone who's had a kind of unflappable sense of cool about him throughout his career. I mean, I would love to read like a production diary of this film, because it reads to me like they might have just given up like halfway through. I mean, think about what like a nightmare the production schedules for this must have been, a movie just with this many like movie stars. I'm sure Adam Driver is shooting it like between Star Wars movies. A lot of like the bad reviews on Letterboxd note that there's a lot of like awful like day for night shooting in this, and like some bad like CGI and stuff. Like, I don't know. It feels like maybe some of the just shortcomings might be in keeping with a movie that is just sort of, I don't know, is sort of tossed off because it had to be, because it's just it's the world we live in now is not permissible to a better version of this movie getting made.
That's why, like, I could take the political messages a little more seriously if I didn't think a lot of that stuff was going on in the film, especially, like, even the things that I could take sort of lightheartedly, like Iggy Pop as a zombie drinking out of a coffee pot and things like that. But I think that's kind of another one of my pet peeves about this film is that like the sort of the star-studded nature of it really bothers me. And I don't think that having an ensemble cast or having a ton of stars is necessarily a bad thing if they all sort of add something with substance to the film or add something interesting to the piece. But I find everyone's performances just like across the board to be so lackluster and sort of phoned in, like that, like what you're saying, Bennett, like it feels like a film where everybody just like phoned it in completely. And like you have all of these extremely talented artists on this and you have this end product and you're like, if you added it up like a math problem or something, you'd be like, how do we get this, you know what I mean? But and that's why, and it's the things like Selena Gomez saying, "Hi, I'm Zoe," and sparkles happening over her head. It's like, yeah, we know she's Selena Gomez, Jim Jarmusch. Like, you don't have to, put sparkles over her head or something like that. And like, and same with like the references. Like, I think it's a lot worse in Only Lovers Left Alive because they seemingly can't not reference a famous artist or poet or painter in every 30 seconds in that film to show that these are cool vampires who are immortal who hung out with every cool person in the history of the world. But in this film it's like, oh, Bobby's wearing a Nosferatu shirt, he makes a George Romero reference. It's like, oh my god, we're such cinephiles. And it's like, and like to your point, I think we were talking about this yesterday, Bennett, where it's like how seriously are we supposed to take oh, your film knowledge is so impressive, that one line, because both Nosferatu and George Romero are not like deep cuts.
Pretty entry level.
It's not like you're a crazy cinephile if you've seen Night of the Living Dead or something like that. It's like, I think that's like one of the first films you watch if you want to get into this kind of stuff. So it's like I can never tell whether he's being snide or if he's being serious or something. I think that's another part of this film that it feels like the low effort nature of it confuses me so much, where I don't know like what to take seriously and what not to take seriously, but in a way where it's like, oh, he just didn't give a shit sometimes.
I in general do not like movies like this where it's wall to wall famous names and faces. I just find it like really distracting when like every person in a movie is like attractive enough to lead a movie. Oppenheimer has recently run into some controversy with the upcoming Christopher Nolan movie because it's like 70 white people, but like I actually think he gets a couple people. I think he has some fun with who he has play into the type they usually play. Like, for example, Rosie Perez really seems to be overdoing her famous annoying accent in this movie, which I think is great. I say annoying affectionately as well. I love Rosie Perez's crazy accent. Whereas I think like Caleb Landry Jones, I think is actually really great playing kind of against type. He usually plays like Ben Foster, like, ooh, don't bring him along types. And here he's like sort of like the nerdy clerk at the convenience store. I think Chloe Sevigny, who usually plays really kind of like unflappably cool Jarmuschian characters, is the cop who really like loses her cool and like breaks down at the end. I think an almost affecting scene, I'll say. You mentioned the Iggy Pop coffee zombie thing too. I think the first sequence with the zombies is some ace 90s, early 2000s like studio comedy type physical stuff. Like it's like fat suit comedy type stuff, like throwing like boiling coffee on them like just sort of like stumbling around, bumping into each other. I like how long he lingers on that stuff. Like I think I don't know, like he's tuned into I think some of like the surface pleasures of this movie. For as much if it doesn't work.
Yeah, and overall, I think a lot of this stuff wouldn't bother me if there was just any interesting technique going on in the film as a whole. Like I think, in a lot of my, of his other films, something that I love is his cinematography, like how he shoots space, how like even a small space like a jail cell can look differently if you used, inventive camera angles or, interesting plays with light or something like that. Like he really stretches his ability to shoot these sort of limited spaces or even shows things that aren't limited in really strange ways. And it's just like, there are no moments in The Dead Don't Die where I think, oh man, that's his signature visual style. It all just seems like very by the book, which I think is another thing that sort of disappointed me, is because I never think of him as like this by the book, visual style kind of guy, where this seems very just like chained to the narrative kind of film.
Jarmusch's greatest strength and weakness stylistically is his use of repetition. I will say I love the diner scene when they all walk in and they just say like the exact same thing. Like, was it an animal? Uh, that was great. But I mean, even in things like Night on Earth, like, the radio broadcast that ties it all together, I love that. But he just goes so far. I feel like, especially his more modern movies, like, he just doesn't know when to stop the repetition at times. I mean, what do you guys think about his repetition?
I'm sort of divided about it. I enjoy repetition as a stylistic technique. I can think it can be something very powerful, and not to make like an out of the blue reference, but when I think of someone like Bresson, like how he uses repetition, it's incredibly powerful in his films how he uses it. And I think it's sometimes powerful when Jarmusch uses it in his films, or oftentimes I should say.
Right.
It was grating on me a little bit in The Dead Don't Die, especially the song. I felt like how Bill Murray felt like, where he just wanted to take the CD and throw it out the window of the car and destroy it. I was like, I'm so tired of hearing this song at this point, which I think is also the point of what he's doing. I don't think Jarmusch is like, oh, that bothered you. No, he was like trying to bother you the whole time. So I guess that's a point in favor for him for the style of it. But I really enjoy that diner scene as well, Craig, where they were walking inside the diner and going out and asking if it was a wild animal or several wild animals. I liked that part of the film. Mm-hmm. Like, that's very low in my list of sort of pet peeves with this film sort of thing. I think that's actually a one in the good column for me.
Okay.
It surprises me a little bit the degree to which this was greeted as like a total, like nothing else he'd ever made, like total departure. Almost all of his movies take place in some sort of like not quite apocalyptic, but definitely like rundown, sort of dilapidated settings. I mean, Permanent Vacation, I think, might literally be like after an apocalypse.
So.
But Stranger Than Paradise and most of his movies, they're going through these sort of barren landscapes. They often look like almost like Western, like ghost towns or something. And I don't know. This movie opens with like a literal shot of a cemetery, as if to say that, like, yeah, we're dialing the usual sort of misery and barrenness up. And all of his movies are about like aliens in a certain respect too. They're often about people who are in a new place. They don't speak the language. They're unfamiliar with the terrain, the customs. And this movie has an actual alien in it, as played by Tilda Swinton. So I don't know. I can't think of another example off the top of my head, but I like that this is like his consensus worst film, but also like the apotheosis of so many things he does in all of his other films. It's so fun to see him like take stuff to the extreme and see people react with just disgust. Mm-hmm. It's late style, baby.
I completely agree about the dilapidated landscapes, especially like Detroit and Only Lovers Left Alive. He's very deliberate about how he's talking about sort of the fall of Detroit and things like that. And so I enjoy that aspect too. I think that's one of the parts that I didn't think about it until we were speaking about it yesterday. That he portrays all of these environments with such like brutal honesty, and I think a little aggression too. Like when he films New York City, he's not, Woody Allen or something like that, and he's like, oh, this is the most beautiful place in the world. He's like, no, it's like filled with mud and dirt and grime, and Ava gets off of the plane and walks through like, puddles.
It looks like the opening of Eraserhead or something.
Yeah. It's like a dystopian landscape instead of, George Gershwin playing in a montage of Central Park or something like that. So I completely agree that like his landscapes are very similar in how sort of dystopian and apocalyptic they feel. I mean, Memphis it feels like it's falling apart at the seams and just like made with rust and Mystery Train,
Right, and that's like a great example too. It's like people are going to it as like a destination, and it turns out to be like nothing like what they expected. Yeah. And most of the cities in Night on Earth are shown to be especially desolate. I think especially the Finnish chapter is really sort of like sad and stark. I don't know. I know I was shitting on like fan service and like like one for the fans and like little like spot the reference type stuff. But I'll admit I was so happy when Esther Ballant shows up in The Dead Don't Die. I think she's so great in Stranger Than Paradise. And then when Louis C.K. had that TV show before he died, she was on like a 6-episode arc. And gave a great performance. I don't know. I like seeing her pop up in things.
So Ben, I do want to return to an idea we touched on earlier. I mentioned I see these as kind of the polar extremes of Jarmusch, where one is pretty much blatantly an art film. This one is about as lighthearted as he gets. You kind of said you feel there's a bit more overlap than that. Do you want to elaborate on that?
They are the opposites in the sense that they represent extremes of tone and of seriousness.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they're very much of a piece in that they represent kind of what I talked about, him dialing up what people usually like about his films to like an extreme. They both have these kind of like show-offy, star-studded casts. They both really just kind of like drop you into this world and kind of expect you to figure it out. They both really deliberately avoid most of what you'd expect from the genre they ostensibly fall into. And then they both have those kind of like nudging, kind of like fourth wall breaks that seem to say like, "Is this what you want? Is this what you want?" So I don't know. Even if they occupy kind of like opposite ends of like the respectability spectrum, I think they find Jarmusch in somewhat similar trollish modes.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that if I don't watch The Dead Don't Die and say, who is this? Like, I don't know who this person is. No, like, this is the person that has been making these films all along. It's just something happened. Like, something broke in his mind or in all of the actors' mind. Like, something must have happened during this production cycle where things just, like, went totally off the rails. Because, I mean, I agree with all your points. I think it's all there. But I think a lot of the idiosyncrasies that get sort of downturned in his other films, like the references especially, which is, I hate all of the referential stuff in films in general. It's like, it annoys me. But it's just so strong in this film because there's a lack of other things. I think the balance is all off. To me, there's like an equilibrium in a lot of Jarmusch films where he constantly wants to tell you all of the musicians he loves. He wants to tell you all of the artists he loves. This is a cool painter. This is a cool writer or philosopher. But it's offset by these other sort of technical aspects of this film, which make it, palatable for me, at least personally. And I think in this film, because the pendulum is swinging so far to one side, that's why I find it sort of disappointing. But I think over the years, I'll calm down about it. And I mean, maybe in 10 years, I'll watch The Dead Don't Die and be like, man, this is going to be a 3-star film instead of a 2-star film or something like that. I can grow eventually,
It's interesting. A lot of like the good critics liked Limits of Control in its time. At least I've seen like Jay Oberman and
Manola
Jonathan
Dargis,
Rosenbaum
I think,
really
liked
liked it. Yeah. Michael Koreski for Reverse Shot wrote a pretty positive review. I think called it like his best film in a decade. I have not really seen anybody go to bat for The Dead Don't Die. I want to say Richard Brody wrote a positive review of it, but I'm not sure. So I don't know. I might be among the very few people carrying the torch for The Dead Don't Die for a while, but hopefully people come around on it.
You can corner the market.
It seems like on Letterboxd, it sits in like a 3-ish ballpark for a fair amount of people I follow, which is good.
I think that's fair, too. I don't think this is a film that should be like, thrown in a mud puddle or something like that. I don't think this is like the worst film I've ever seen or anything like that. It's just I feel so closely connected with some of his, I think, more profound work that when I watch this, I yearn for, a different, more focused Jarmusch. It's not as bad as like Gimme Danger or something like that, where I'm like, what
that's the one I haven't seen.
Oh, my God. You don't need to see that. Yeah, it's so disappointing. It's like the most boring documentary about the most exciting band ever, sort of thing. That's a good tagline for it. But
yeah, I mean, I do see the consensus on Dead Don't Die in the future taming. I think people will realize it's not an art film. It's just a fun thing, and they'll be like, yeah, it's fine. I mean, my take I don't think we really need to do a pick on these two today just because you two are so clearly on Team Limits of Control, but I'll say this. Limits of Control, I definitely have to be in the right mood for. If it was like these are the two movies on the table, I would probably pick Dead Don't Die more often just because it is like, whatever, it's Friday night, let's do that. That's my 2 cents.
Fair. I mean, that's totally, I don't think The Limits of Control is a relaxing film by any, like I don't want to work like a 10-hour shift and then come home and watch The Limits of Control. Starting so I think that's totally fair. And I think that to me, that's a strength of the film is that it you have to have some skin in the game. I like to watch this film. Like you have to use some energy to watch this film, which I think is another reason why it sort of pushes people away, and why hopefully I think it takes a different kind of viewership. which, sounds like, oh man, you're just not watching the film the right way. It's like, no, it's a difficult film to watch for anybody, regardless of who you are. It just takes some time.
So I think my last question is more of a general Jarmusch question. So a lot of my friends, they have only seen Patterson or some of his new stuff. I'm shocked that Down by Law, Dead Man, Stranger Than Paradise, like those aren't his top films. Do you think the way you, like the order in which you see these films colors your overall reception of them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I could see someone coming from like Patterson being kind of baffled by the earlier stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously there's plenty of like traits in common, but yeah, I don't know, his newer movies, I think the repetition has gotten to be too much for me, and I don't know, obviously some people like it. They're the more popular movies on Letterboxd and IMDb for a reason beyond just the recency, but I would encourage people to go watch the kind of wilder genre experiments like Dead Man and Limits of Control.
Yeah.
More abrasive movies, because I don't know, I know I've been singing the praises of The Dead Don't Die as like such a like relaxing, lackadaisical movie, but like I don't know, Patterson and Only Lovers Left Alive have such like, I don't know, just like soporific pacing, and I don't know, you go back to something like Stranger Than Paradise, and even if it is sort of like meandering, it feels kind of immediate and I don't know, improvisational in a way that these ones don't. These new ones feel so mannered. I think another reason I kind of like had a knee-jerk reaction to Jarmusch that was sort of negative is I really kind of blame him for foisting like epic Bill Murray and epic Tilda Swinton onto us. I mean, he gave us John Lurie and like Esther Ballant and Tom Waits the actor, but he's also got a lot of sins to atone for when it comes to like helping actors craft personas that we now have to see in like every freaking movie.
Yeah, I would implore people to start with his first film and just go forward from there. He's one of the first. I think he's one of the few filmmakers that I would say that about, because sometimes when I recommend filmmakers to other people, I'll be like, there's this film that's a good entry point, this film that's a good entry point. But really and truly, I think if you want to experience Jarmusch's career, just go from the first to the last sort of thing. But there's a real shift at a certain point from these films that are so like charged in a way. Like Stranger Than Paradise is kind of a meditative, slower film, but it's so charged with this energy that it's like I am cutting down all of American mythology with this film. Like everything you've seen in other Hollywood depictions of New York City, you're not going to see that here. If anything, you're going to see the opposite. Same with Permanent Vacation. And I think that atmosphere is sort of lacking in some of his newer films, that like edge. Like I think it's strange to me sometimes that Jarmusch gets labeled as this like cool director, because I think a lot of his films have a bite to them. Like that, when I think of Jarmusch, I think of almost like acidity to his work, and not this like cool guy, smooth dude. You know what I mean? Like I think of someone who has like something really biting to say that's gonna upset people, and I think until like Dead Man, which I think is the most exaggerated of that, basically saying that all Westerns are just complete bullshit. I mean, like that film is like the hellish, response to all of the beautiful Westerns that you've ever seen. And then something changes in his career, which who knows what, maybe he'll explain it at some point, but
it all feels, I hate to compare everything to prestige TV without like defining my terms there, but like, yeah, I don't know, so much of his stuff feels like very like Ryan Murphy-ish lately. Like Only Lovers Left Alive felt like an episode of American Horror Story. Like it really felt like, that level of like spot the reference, fan servicey type stuff. Like, yeah, could have used another pass in the draft, on the script.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if someone watched Only Lovers Left Alive and then they watched Permanent Vacation afterwards, I think they would be extremely surprised, because like, I mean, it's almost like unrecognizable sometimes. Like you can still see the Jarmusch in both of those films, but something like Permanent Vacation is almost like aggressively unconventional. You know what I mean? And which has to do with like the production of that film and things like that. But I think that's like to me, that's the difference, is that like his films before had some like acid and bite to them, and like some aggression to them and some confrontation. And when I see his newer work, it doesn't really have that sort of tone and atmosphere to it, which maybe he's a happier person. I don't know. Maybe this is a good thing. Maybe this shows that he's grown, like he's grown, and maybe he's happier or something like that. So I don't think we should lament that sort of change, but hopefully the technique stays if the atmosphere changes,
You guys have any final thoughts on Jarmusch before we head out?
I'll just say, I'm excited to see what he does next. He's hardly my favorite filmmaker, but I think The Dead Don't Die is really more interesting than it got credit for, obviously. And, he's probably he's one of the few, like, indie directors who can, like, we can definitely count on to probably keep getting money to make films, even if it comes from, a dozen different European sources or whatever. He'll probably get to keep working. So I'm interested to see what he does next. If maybe the reaction to Dead Don't Die inspires another reinvention.
If the path holds up, Dead Don't Die definitely feels like one for you. One for me is coming. So we'll see what he does.
Yeah, and not to get too sappy about it too, but he really is a director that like opened my world to a whole different perspective on film in regards to independent American cinema particularly. So I have not lost hope. He's going to make many more great films to come. And so like, I'm not one of those people who's like, Jarmusch is gone or something like that. No, like, he is who he is, and he's made some amazing films and he's made some not so amazing films. And, I believe in the artist. So,
I mean, to me, even his films that I'll say, like, I'm not a huge fan of, I think Broken Flowers is my lowest rated one. I still gave it 3 stars. Like,
yeah,
his worst films are still like what many people's best would be. Like he's great all around. I think. I mean, he has some questionable tendencies, but who doesn't? All right. Well, we will wrap it up there. Rob, Bennett, thank you guys again for joining us. It's always good to have you two. We'll do more of these. We'll get back in the groove. And then, once again, happy 4th birthday to Split Tooth. Like, subscribe, follow, share.
There really is no place like Split Tooth. Like, I know we're all in the game and we're all in the Split Tooth family, but, for music and film, there really is no other place like it. So, bam.
We do what we can. Thanks for listening.